So, let's not leave the TV on, and either turn off the lights in the living room or your room.
Got it, got it. I'll make sure to save energy.
I left the house to go shopping far away. Whether I was out or at home, the whole family was committed to the energy-saving campaign, such as turning off lights and setting the right temperature for the air conditioning. Just like any other day, we reminded each other before I went out. But when I returned a few hours later, our beloved home had changed dramatically.
If you like saving that much, I'll save energy for you,
was the spiteful laughter of my sister-in-law. She had sneaked in and turned off our home's main power, causing a major problem. The reason she did such a thing. My name is Hannah. At 29, I married Tom, who is the same age, and moved in with my in-laws. My mother-in-law had already passed away, and my father-in-law, who has a chronic respiratory condition, was living alone in the house. Persuaded by my husband, who was worried about his condition, I started living with them while continuing my job. There was also my unmarried sister-in-law, Amy, living there, but we never really got along. My father-in-law is a gentle and kind man, much like my husband. In contrast, Amy has a volatile temper and is prone to emotional outbursts. As someone who speaks her mind, I often clashed with her, barely managing to keep her in check despite being a few years older. Without her, life would be peaceful itself. However, within 6 months, my father-in-law's illness worsened. He needed an oxygen machine to stay at home. Both Amy and I were working, so we couldn't be there to help him during the day. We should have arranged for him to enter a care facility where he could live comfortably, but he didn't want to leave the home filled with memories of his wife. Consulting with my husband, we concluded that forcibly moving him would be worse for his health and unfair. So, we decided to hire a helper, but that's where another problem arose. Not only was my relationship with Amy poor, but she also disliked having strangers in her home and began to harass the helpers.
Unseen by us, she hurled insults and sarcasm, disrupting their work and repeatedly complaining to the agency that they were unfit to care for our father, saying, "You can't entrust Dad to them."
By the time we realized why so many helpers were quitting, it was too late. The agency told us they could no longer send anyone new, effectively give up on us. What do we do now? Other agencies have turned us down too. It's probably because we're blacklisted. Damn, it's all Amy's fault. We became known as a troublesome household, and our last hope, the helper service, was no longer an option. All we could do was sigh and think of a solution. Amy, already isolated due to her selfish nature, faced reprimands from my husband, her brother, leading to intense arguments until he finally told her to move out and live independently. But Amy, resentful of being scolded, turned her frustrations towards me, easier to confront.
"You're the one who married into this family, so you should take care of it, right? My brother can't quit his job because he's a man, but you're different."
This caused yet another fight when my husband heard it. This was not helping my father-in-law to rest and recuperate. Though it irked me to comply with Amy's words, we couldn't keep arguing. My father-in-law, trying not to burden me in this new environment, always acted cheerfully despite his illness, making an effort to make me feel welcome. I felt a deep sense of gratitude towards him. I'll quit my job and take care of him. I'll start learning about caregiving bit by bit. After all, he's family to me too. When I finally decided to resign for caregiving, both my father-in-law and husband were tearfully grateful. Caregiving was a completely new field for me, full of challenges and struggles, but my father-in-law always encouraged me kindly. The one constant is my sister-in-law. She never bothered to move out and is always at home. Yet, she doesn't lift a finger to help with household chores or caregiving. On her days off, she vanishes without a trace, apparently out to play. I do have more free time now, but there are still my father-in-law's needs and my caregiving studies to consider. Though my husband and I split the household chores, when we fall short, my sister-in-law is quick to criticize.
"Well, you were the one who decided to take on caregiving and household duties, right? You like doing everything yourself, don't you?" she'd say.
If I talk back, she retorts with sarcasm. She keeps harassing me this way, but soon gets scolded by my husband and others.
Every time, she plays the victim. "Dad is too kind to speak up. I'm just saying what he won't."
But nothing changes, and her constant meddling only interrupts my work and piles on the stress. I feel indebted to the cheerful helpers who manage to care for my father-in-law despite her antics. Not just me, but my father-in-law and others are fed up with her persistent attitude. However, my husband and I have been quietly discussing how to encourage her to move out. Then, one day, she abruptly announces, "I've got a fiancé, so I'm moving out."
Bye.
Dad. I'll visit sometimes, and just like that, she left. We were stunned, but the household became more peaceful without her stormy presence. My father-in-law was considering moving to a care facility due to his age and condition, but since I was getting the hang of caregiving, we decided to continue with it at home. She seems to be living with her fiancé's family but often returns home. There'll be leftovers from dinner tonight, right? Just put them in a container for me. I'll take them back with me. Apparently, she finds it a hassle to cook for her fiancé and prefers to rely on our leftovers. Her selfishness is as strong as ever, treating me like a maid. "Amy, don't order Hannah around when you won't even help," my father-in-law reprimands.
Yeah.
"Sorry, sis." "Now, can you hurry up with dinner?" she responds, ignoring his scolding with an attitude. Honestly, the amount of food I make hasn't changed since she left, so that's not really an issue. The real problem is the grocery and utility bills. She stopped contributing money after moving out, but her frequent visits and free reign at home are draining my wallet. Moreover, she has no sense of saving energy or money. "Amy, please turn off the lights in rooms you're not using. Can I go ahead and use the bathroom if you're not going to?" I suggest, as she lies on the couch, ignoring the TV while glued to her smartphone games. She has left lights on all the way to the bathroom, showing no sign of moving. The bath gets cold, and her dawdling holds everyone else up. When I suggest she decide between gaming and bathing, she glares at me, annoyed. "Fine, I was about to go anyway. Don't rain on my parade. You're always on about saving energy, like a broken record. It hardly makes a difference. You're so petty, auntie," she snaps. "Amy. What a way to speak." I said, "Sis. Don't get mad when you misheard," she talks back as my father-in-law scolds her. But despite her biting remarks, she seems to listen to what I say. She's been working for years and even has a fiancé, yet she still acts like a rebellious teenager. I've long since stopped expecting her to act her age. It never bothered me, but our relationship hasn't improved since she moved out. The tension remains. I thought discussions about saving might bridge the gap, but that seems unlikely now. One day, I was driving to a large shopping mall in the suburbs, as requested by my father-in-law. He can go out, but it involves carrying a portable oxygen tank, which is not only cumbersome but also visibly marks him as needing oxygen, which he finds embarrassing. Though he's often asked for errands, they're usually done when my husband is home. We try not to leave him alone, but this time, I had no choice but to leave him behind. Though worried, my father-in-law is not helpless. He only uses an oxygen tank because he has difficulty breathing, but he can still do quite a bit on his own. I asked him to use the air conditioning as much as needed, even though it's important to save energy, then I left for the store. Hours later, after finishing my shopping, I returned to the driveway with my arms full of bags. Though I had left in the late morning, it was already turning to evening. Suddenly, I took out my smartphone before entering the house. There might be a message from my husband about dinner. But, when I looked at the screen, I was shocked. What? There were countless missed calls. From my husband, my father-in-law, and the general hospital he attends. A cold sweat broke out on my back. I had switched my phone to silent mode while driving and, in my rush to return earlier than usual, I hadn't turned it back and failed to notice any calls until now. A bad feeling swept over me. I tried to call my husband back, but after several rings, there was no answer. With growing anxiety, I tried my father-in-law's number next, but there was no sign of him picking up. Lastly, I called the hospital, clinging to a sliver of hope. A receptionist answered, and I managed to keep my composure as I asked about my father-in-law. "Your father-in-law is currently hospitalized. We cannot provide more details over the phone. Could you please come here?" After being transferred through several departments, I was informed of this and I froze. I replied that I would be there immediately, then hurriedly started the car again. The car was filled with urgency. As if mirroring my anxiety, the roads were congested. Before I left, my father-in-law was well and saw me off as usual. Why had he suddenly been hospitalized? I deeply regretted leaving him alone. Upon arriving at the hospital, I was directed to his room. I walked down the tense hallway and gently opened the door to find my husband already there. We looked at each other in surprise. However, he explained that he had been at the hospital waiting for my father-in-law's tests, which is why he couldn't answer the phone. I too had been unreachable while driving. I'm sorry for not answering the phone. No, it's okay. So, how is he? He urged me to look at my father-in-law, who was sleeping in the bed. He seemed a bit pale, but the breathing problems I feared seemed under control. He's okay. There's no problem with his condition. It's just a hospital stay for some tests. Actually, hearing from my husband that my father-in-law was not in danger, I finally relaxed. Then, why was he admitted to the hospital? I was about to ask this when the door of the room was suddenly flung open. In rushed my sister-in-law, eyes filled with terror, ignoring us and heading straight for my father-in-law's bed. Seeing him lying there, she screamed loudly. "Oh no. What's happened to Dad?" Her voice, loud with panic, filled the room. "Please, calm down," my husband pleaded, trying to soothe her. But her frantic voice only quieted down after a while, and then she suddenly glared at me, starting to yell with a torrent of emotions. "You were with him! What happened?" The angry voice pierces through, leaving me momentarily speechless. My husband steps in to calm things down, but the anger is still directed at me. In the midst of the confusion, I'm caught by a strange sensation. My father-in-law needs oxygen therapy, but a sudden hospitalization seems improbable. Wait. Can't you listen calmly for a moment? My husband turns back to us with a calm tone, sharing what he knows. It turns out, the reason for my father-in-law's hospitalization was that the power to his oxygen device had been cut off. After I left, he had been sleeping in his room, but during that time, the power went off. Waking up struggling for breath, he tried to turn the device back on, but for some reason, it wouldn't start, and he couldn't reach either me or my husband. Connecting a portable cylinder, he managed to catch his breath, but was anxious waiting for an unpredictable return from us. Feeling a headache and no way to get around since we usually drove him, he decided to go to the hospital. He tried to call a taxi, but his hands started shaking so much that he couldn't even make the call. Eventually, he went next door to ask if they could call a taxi. The neighbor, coming out to the door, screamed at the sight of him. Taken to the living room and laid down, he was cooled with bags of ice while they called an ambulance, and that's when he first realized he was suffering from heat stroke. Thanks to the appropriate treatment at the hospital, his condition stabilized, and he was out of danger. According to the doctor, my father-in-law might not feel the heat due to his age, and he mistook his trembling hands and headache as normal aging symptoms. He was treated immediately for his convulsions, leading to an examination and subsequent hospitalization. After hearing my husband's explanation, I boldly raised a question. The power to the device wouldn't turn on. It's hard to believe the plug was pulled out. We installed it in a spot where it wouldn't come loose even if tripped over, right? My husband frowned, pondering deeply. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law remained silent. But anyone could see her face was ashen. That's right. It couldn't have come loose on its own. I went back home to check, but the plug wasn't pulled out. Then, what happened? His words only added to my confusion. He had returned home to prepare things for the hospital stay and found that while the power was out, the plug was still in. He looked at my sister-in-law with a stern face. It was clear she was hiding something, but I couldn't understand why my husband was so angry. In the next moment, he raised his voice at her. You turned off the breaker, didn't you? What have you got to say for yourself? As his voice echoed in the hospital room, she flinched, starting to tremble. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out, just inaudible sounds. Then, my husband pulled something from his pocket. There had been several calls from the hospital to me, my husband, and my sister-in-law, but he was the first to connect. Returning home to prepare for the hospital stay, he immediately felt something was off. As soon as he opened the front door, an unbelievable wave of heat hit him. The hallway lights wouldn't turn on. Realizing this, he checked around the house, confirming that all electrical appliances were stopped. Rushing to the breaker, he found it switched off, as he suspected. Along with the surprise, he was puzzled. Why would this happen? There were no reports of lightning strikes or anything that could trip a breaker. And no other houses seemed to be affected. But then, my husband remembered something. Actually, our house is equipped with several security cameras. They were installed by my father-in-law before I married into the family, due to a past burglary, to alleviate my mother-in-law's anxiety. While we do try to save money, there was one thing that couldn't be removed because it was for everyone's safety. The footage should remain until the blackout occurred. Thinking this, my husband rushed to restore the electricity and checked the records. Here's the footage. I wanted to show it to both of you and transferred it. What my husband pulled out in the hospital room was his smartphone. He showed us the transferred footage. First, it showed the familiar entrance of our house. A few minutes after I left, my sister-in-law appeared. It was the first time I knew she had come to our house, and I inadvertently looked at her sitting next to me. She enters inside with her own key. The usual noise was absent. Instead, she looked around and seemed to be scouting the surroundings conspicuously. It was as if she was confirming my absence. My husband then operated his smartphone, switching to the footage from a camera inside the entrance. The location of our house's circuit breaker is near the ceiling above the shoe cabinet. My sister-in-law climbed on a chair meant for wearing shoes and opened the lid of the breaker. "What are you doing?" Even though I knew what was happening, I couldn't suppress my scream. The camera had a sound recognition system that recorded everything, including the rustling sounds and her chilling mutterings. "This is the breaker, right? If the fridge stops, that penny-pinching old lady will have to calm down a bit, won't she?" A malevolent laugh echoed in the silent hospital room. "Look, I'm giving you your favorite power saving, there you go." After that, the footage ended because the breaker was turned off. We were at a loss for words, standing there in shock. Of course, turning off the breaker would stop the power supply throughout the house. For the few hours until my husband noticed, the contents of the fridge must have turned into a disaster, just as she planned. From the way she rushed into the hospital room, it was clear she hadn't realized her actions could endanger her own father's life. It was a malicious way to teach me a lesson. However, she took an action I could never have anticipated. "Just because you're always nagging about saving energy." Tearfully, she started to justify herself, unrepentant. "I didn't know Dad was home. I thought he went out with you, it's your fault for leaving him." She kept repeating this, as if in disbelief. In contrast to her tearful self-defense, my heart was ablaze with anger. Breaking in like a thief and turning off the breaker, it's a miracle he survived. If anything had happened to him. I couldn't help but lash out at my sister-in-law, but she raised her voice in accusation against me. "But it's your fault. That Dad was there. It's all because of you." Her accusation pierced my heart. Indeed, I should not have left him behind. Leaving him was a mistake, saying that going far would be too much for him. Tension filled the hospital room, suddenly shattered by a voice. "Quiet down." My father-in-law, who was supposed to be asleep, scolded her. He could not raise his voice much due to his illness. Being naturally gentle, we were all surprised. All three of us turned to look at him at once. "Do you realize what you've done? Causing trouble for everyone, nearly killing your own father. Hannah is not to blame." His eyes were filled with anger and disappointment. His tone was much harsher than his usual mild demeanor. The commotion and screams from my sister-in-law had completely awakened him, and he had heard the whole conversation about the surveillance cameras. "If you keep making noise, leave. And don't ever come back to this house." Scolded, my sister-in-law turned pale and froze, but then began to cry as if ignited. Her voice was indeed loud, a supreme annoyance.
My sister-in-law was apologizing to my father-in-law, but he told her, "You're a nuisance, leave," and my husband expelled her from the hospital room.
My father-in-law's discharge was just a few days later. When we went to pick him up from the hospital, he greeted us with a relieved smile, perhaps because his health had improved. But upon returning home, my sister-in-law was waiting at the front door. She hadn't shown herself to us since that incident. We were expecting an apology, but what came out of her mouth was the same as before.
"It's all your fault. Dad ended up like this all because of you."
Both my father-in-law and husband wore expressions of utter dismay. Unrepentant, she was still blaming me when my father-in-law stepped forward.
"Be thankful I'm not pressing charges because we're family. Your behavior is absolutely unforgivable."
In the cold voice that hadn't changed since the hospital, she was silenced. But my father-in-law didn't stop there. He had come to despise her from the bottom of his heart.
"This is disownment. I can't believe you still don't understand the gravity of the situation after what you've done. I said it in the hospital, but I'll say it again, never come to our house again."
With stern words, he brushed past my sister-in-law and walked into the house. She probably never imagined being disowned by her own father. She stood there, dumbfounded. We decided to stand by my father-in-law's anger and be on his side. So we left her outside and returned home. After that, my sister-in-law sent numerous apologies. However, my father-in-law ignored them all. After so much trouble, we felt no sympathy for her, and we kept to that. He had been asked for financial help with her wedding and honeymoon, but he refused everything and firmly stated he would not attend the wedding. One day, I was ambushed outside our home. She was desperately pleading, begging me to persuade my father-in-law, but I had already decided not to forgive her. Knowing ignoring her would only make her more persistent, I quietly listened to all she had to say and then left her standing there. This whole series of events eventually became known to her fiancé. My father-in-law had declined to attend the wedding for safety reasons, but the fiancé, puzzled by this, reached out to him. After hearing the story, which my sister-in-law had twisted to suit her own narrative, the fiancé was horrified and apologized to my father-in-law. Unlike her, he seemed to be a reasonable person. He called her actions attempted murder, and ultimately, their marriage was called off. The lease for their new home was cancelled before moving in, and the fiancé kicked her out. She had already quit her job, calling it a marriage resignation, and had nearly emptied her savings on beauty treatments and salons in preparation for the wedding. Furthermore, she was now faced with paying half of the wedding cancellation fees, a recent event, plunging her into debt. But she never showed her face to us again, perhaps out of sheer shame. Meanwhile, the three of us have been living peacefully. Without my sister-in-law's turmoil and harm, my father-in-law's health seems to have improved more than before. While we can't be careless due to his age, it seems we don't need to consider hospitalization in a care facility for a while. We're even planning a trip, that's how much better things have become.